Hello, we're going to introduce Western historiography today for our kind of first lecture of the semester. And it's a word that we'll try to explain the meaning of, especially as it relates to the West. The American West is kind of this paradigm. It's come over the last few years as something of a cliche. There's a lot of debate about it. What are the confines of the West? Where do we start it? It's kind of a dream and a metaphor, and you can visualize your own image of the West, whether it's just the immediate West or the West as a place. It's really tough to stereotype the individuals, especially when we're talking about the American West. When we're talking about the different indigenous people, Native Americans, the Lakotas, the Navajo, the Apache, we're talking about very different Indian nations that lived in the West before any European contact after 1492. And then, of course, you throw in after the American era begins, uh, immigrants who arrived from different parts of the world, from Europe, from Asia, from Canada, from Latin America, and a lot of it was related to not only our nation being always one of immigrants, but also things like the pull factors to the West, such as the California land rush, which you're going to be reading a lot about in the course of this semester. So, like the residents who live there, the West kind of changes its definition over time, and no two people have the same kind of ideas of the West. We have one person, Andrew Jackson, man, we think of as the first president from the West. So it's an era of firsts. And he really didn't live in a West as we considered it. He actually was born in the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, but we associate him very much with the West because when he left central North Carolina, he moved to what at the time for him and for a lot of Americans who were east of the Mississippi River, he moved to the West, and that was a small village which became Nashville, Tennessee. So, also on this subject, academics, people who are at universities, like to talk about and discuss the myths and realities of the West. And it's a subject of a lot of popular culture today. The Western is still around. It's still a genre of film that we're, pretty popular. Think of Yellowstone or um, any of the spin-offs of Yellowstone that have been done, or Kevin Costner doing a multi-part movie, American Horizon, which was just going to be on the West, and it kind of got a really dramatic saga to it. And filmmakers love it for the images, the symbolism. Monument Valley, which is almost a rule that you see in every Western. Documents abound about it. Ken Burns did one on the West, fairly well done, talking about in many ways our own time frame from the end of the American Revolution until the closing of the frontier. What historiography means is what we're going to get to in this discussion. So we have a mix when we talk about the West, and we as Americans go through this idea of we're curious about it. There's an admiration, an awe, sometimes a distaste for the West when we consider the exploitation of the people and the resources in the West, subjects that we're still dealing with to this day. And so that makes it a little bit difficult to be objective, encompass the West. And we want to talk about all of it, the deep contradictions that exist in that region. Uh, and it's hard to do because we don't know where the West starts. Where do we begin the story of the West? And so any year we throw out is somewhat arbitrary. The West isn't no longer a subject after 1890, and so we just decide to stop in 1890 for the reasons that will be clear as we go along this whole semester, and then to talk about how the West and the story of the West should end. And so mythology around the West is how your textbook kind of wraps it up. So that's where we come to the end of the story, talking about a nostalgic kind of remembrance of it, which isn't always based in fact. So there's been a lot of new scholarship on the subject in recent years, and it's all under that kind of umbrella of giving a more accurate, truer story of the West. It's a more inclusive history. It deals more with Native Americans, not just as a group that lacked any agency and things were just done to the first inhabitants, Native Americans in the West. The environment is a big part of new scholarship in the West and how it was used, misused, abused, whatever you want to say, from people who either didn't care or didn't know any better. Understanding that the resources in the West are quite finite. Participation of different groups. We're going to talk a little bit about Frederick Jackson Turner. And a lot of people like to attack Turner's thesis. It's definitely oriented to a triumphant story, usually about men moving out west. And so it often doesn't include the very nuanced role that women played in the story of the American West. The story about African Americans or Hispanic populations, the story of those who were from China and Japan who came to the American West, specifically the West Coast. So at one point, that wasn't part of the story. And we can apply those groups to different eras of American history and say that lately, recently, and by recently, I mean since, may not be recent in your minds, but recent as far as how long we've been writing history goes, we're talking about the 1960s and the 1970s. Another development that's important is the discussion of the role of government that was critically important for the developing of the West, setting aside land, promoting transportation, such as the railroad, promoting technology. For if you don't have the um, Pony Express or the Swift mail carriers or the telegraph, you can't link these sections of the country. And so a lot of this new voices, again, new, a relative term, as a reflection of what happened since the 1960s and the changes that were happening in the 1960s. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, gay rights movement. This goes into all of and stretches this time over several decades. And so, very often, when we see drastic change within the country, how we write history is a reflection of that. So, you had different people going to graduate school in the 1960s, a more diverse men and women, people of different races, orientations who were going to graduate school and writing a different perspective, giving us a more and full understanding. And this applies not only to the West, but to other eras of American history. And that all ties into the idea of historiography. But very often, and I think this applies to the West more than any other era that we're talking about, we hear words like myth and dream when we discuss it. Woodrow Wilson, who again had a strong academic background in political science and history, said, "The West," this is his quote, "has been the great word of our history. The Westerner has been the type and master of our American life." Okay, and that's a viewpoint over 100 years ago. So when we talk about historiography, when we talk about the term defined, it's the study of the way history has been written and is currently being written. So it's, lack of a better word, the history of history, the history of historical writing. So when you're looking at historiography, and it goes into everything that you read when you pick up a book, this is historiography, whether you're reading a biography of Susan B. Anthony, or whether or not you're reading a history of the civil rights era or about antebellum anti-slavery movements. That book is going to be based in the historiography. So you're not studying necessarily and only the events of the past, but the interpretations of those events. And I can throw out a couple of examples. After the Civil War, Southern historians and those sympathetic to the South wrote a lot of the history of Reconstruction. And so it was skewed towards, again, viewing Reconstruction as kind of a grand mistake, maybe with some high hopes, but it didn't turn out to be a net positive. talking about the American Revolution, an era I'm most familiar with. And this goes into the idea that you can interpret different schools of thought about what led to the American Revolution. Was it a real democratic movement for change? Were the English just again and again kind of making mistakes governing their colonies? Things like that. Even in the 1950s, we were talking about how the American Revolution was involved all of the colonists. It was a massive uprising, not again taking into account that not everybody favored breaking from Great Britain. And so we have scholarship on the loyalists and we have scholarship on those who didn't care one way or the other which way the entire rebellion and then the revolution uh, ended up, whether in favor of independence or returning back to Great Britain. So that's what we mean when we talk about historiography. In that last point there, it's the written record of human lives and how historians have attempted to understand them. So I can just boil it down that way again. It's the history of history. So Europeans, when we talk about the West, have dreamed about the possibility of it before they even sail. The West is always something that people are attracted to. The Roman poet Horace talked about it in almost these, again, we'll use the word mythological terms over and over again. Columbus longed to see the West, right? He was going to the Indies. It turned out he was accidentally bumping into a continent. But when he sailed west, he was going to reach a shortcut to the East Indies. He was going to go to the islands off of China and Japan. That's not where he ended up, of course. And that gateway, that shortcut to the west, is what Columbus had dreamed about because he had copies of Marco Polo's journal and his travels that he had written during the 13th century. So it motivates a lot of individuals over time. We think of the explorers. Okay, there is a continent here. Let's continue to move into the continent, find a way that we can shortcut an area through all this landmass. So that leads us to the fabled Northwest Passage, right? The all water route across the Americas, which doesn't really exist. People go to the west from the Caribbean to look for the elusive fountain of youth, which doesn't exist unless you think moving to Florida is a fountain of youth. Gold cities, they're in the west as well. The gold seven cities of Cibola, which the Aztec told the Spanish about, although it was, again, another myth. The Isle of California, was it actually attached to the continent, or was it a place where they were, you know, barely clad Amazonian women were taking up this area of the mythological West? So in more modern times, and it's kind of stressed by this painting, and then of course one we associate so much with Manifest Destiny. You know, we hear this westward the course of empire, the idea in Manifest Destiny that God had basically cast favor on Americans to go all the way across the continent. You can see everyone moving west here. You have, unfortunately, Native Americans and animals and buffalo moving out of the way. They were an inconvenient barrier by those. At the bottom, you can see those who were placer miners, and you see folks in Conestoga wagons, and you see people leading oxen over plows. You see the railroad. You see cities being born in the top of this. So that's a really symbolic painting, rich with a lot of meaning. You hear these phrases, and Manifest Destiny was coined by a Democratic Party during the 1840s newspaper editor. And you also hear things like, "Go west, young man. You will go far." That's the full expression that is often repeated when we're talking about this region of the country. So it's difficult to come up with a definition of the West. Some things are kind of arbitrary. I'm going to pull up a map here, but where the West actually exists, it's more than a century old. Obviously, the history of the historiography of the West. There's still a lack of clarity in the field. We have journals about it, right? You have the Journal of the American West. You've got other Western historical quarterlies. You've got all kinds of different academic journals about the West. You've got books, of course, conferences. And we still don't really have a formal answer about where the West begins. Is it over the Mississippi River? Once upon a time, it was. Is it where things get dry? And on this map, I have what's the line with the 98th and the 100th meridian of the map. That's where you begin to see the conditions on the continent get more and more dry. So the West is over that line, right? Not really, because if you go back a few hundred years, the West used to be, Massachusetts or the frontier of New York. So I think it may be more accurate to say that the West is a process and not just a place. It settles in pockets over time. Uh, the Spanish settled the American Southwest before anyone makes their way into what is now the Carolinas. California was settled and became a state in 1850 before the areas in the Southwest. Washington state is added to the Union before Wyoming. Well, it's further west. That kind of seems strange. But there you have it. So it defies definition. And I wish I could give you something more specific, but you can see how there's, again, uh, a little bit of ambiguity. So someone we had up there, and I think I mentioned him before briefly, who's closely associated with the West, is this gentleman. This is Frederick Jackson Turner. And Turner was a historian. In 1893, he's an up and coming assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, which produces a lot of uh, pretty renowned historians throughout our history. He's very young at the time, something of a prodigy in his 20s. And Turner attended what was the premier historical conference for historians, and that's the American Historical Association meeting. And he decides he's going to give an address, and his address is called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And it's really groundbreaking. He begins by saying, look, the frontier technically closed in 1890, and that's when the Census Bureau, which measures the population every 10 years, um, the census declares in 1890, and here's a quote from the actual 1890 census, up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line, unquote. So that's from the Census Bureau. Were there vast areas of undeveloped parts of the United States in 1890? Yes, absolutely. But what the Census Bureau was saying was that they didn't see any discernible frontier line anymore. And Turner, 3 years later, writes about that. And so what he does is he dismisses the traditional idea. In history, we have what was called kind of a germ theory of North America that was written by a lot of folks like Europeans. But Turner said, no, this is not something I accept. In fact, I reject it. The current wisdom in the germ theory of settlement is that American institutions and values come from Europe. Turner said, no. And you can see the major points here in this PowerPoint slide. The West is not always a place, it's a process. And there are a series of Wests along the frontier. And he calls it the point at which savagery meets civilization. Now, savagery obviously is a very loaded term. You can understand who it would apply to. And this is why Turner is, among a lot of his points, under, to this day, a lot of criticism. But this was 1893. This is 125 plus years ago. And so what Turner says in the major bullet points of the Turner thesis, as we very, very, very much simplify it, is that American history is about folks who are in settled areas and they go to the frontier and they find ways to live in these lands. So this is where the civilization is brought to areas of savagery. And so this is how you explain. This is the explanation for the American development. And that frontier process produces, according to Turner, institutions like democracy and individualism. And so these are unique American characteristics. And these new institutions, democracy, individualism, are based on the idea that free land makes free men. So you can incorporate a lot of the American history, the fact that the government did try to encourage settlement by giving away land in the West. And so what he's saying now is we're not just carrying ideas, carrying institutions and values from Europe, but these are uniquely American. And they're uniquely American because of our situation of developing the West at different frontier lines. And in the last point there, to kind of explain it, Turner claimed that when the 1890 frontier was closed, the first stage of American development was over. And if you're wondering, well, what does that mean? Read that second sentence there. It says it creates uncertainty. For if the frontier no longer exists, how would our development and our economic and democratic ideas be maintained? So a lot of people really interested in this. So this Turner thesis was taken up by Americans who said, all right, we've expanded all the way across the continent. The frontier line is closed. We don't see a frontier. The Census Bureau has declared it. So if we don't keep expanding, what happens next? And then you get into American expansion beyond the boundaries of the continental United States. And we don't like to think of ourselves as a colonizing power or one that establishes territories, which we like to say, which are really colonies. But what would we do if we don't expand? So it's like an organism that cannot grow anymore. That's not really a good thing. So Turner's thesis can apply to a lot of decisions that American leaders make after 1890. You get, of course, our first um, international struggle after the Turner thesis, which is the war with Spain, often called the War of 1898, where we, as a result, take colonies from Spain and develop them on our own as we try to open up more sections of the world. So for Turner, the frontier wilderness turned the European into an American, made them a classic individualist, resourceful, manly, independent. He was describing, people would later say, characteristics that kind of resembled the so-called line between civilization and savagery. He was describing values that we now attach to Native American societies that did exist in the Americas. Turner says, and here's a quote that I'll read: the perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward, new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character. So there you have it. Yeah, it's pretty jingoistic and it's pretty, again, centered on mythology when you think about it. It's very difficult for the individual to go out there and succeed in the frontier. That's why people went in groups. The romanticized lone person or family going out on the frontier. That was a difficult thing to do. But Turner says this is what developed the unique American character. So the frontier explains American democracy, um, the challenges living in the frontier, living in these areas of what Turner called savagery, forged American citizenship. And so, again, in the last century, you can imagine Turner's been very much criticized. Turner bashing is pretty much in vogue. I went to a conference once where there was a whole panel of individual historians beating up the Turner thesis, and yeah, it's got a lot of critics, especially over what you might call this ethnocentrism, uh, which certainly is a part of what he says. When you refer to the frontier as the meeting point between savagery and civilization, that's going to open you up for a lot of critique. So there's a lot of attackers and defenders over Turner, but more of those people who kind of take apart the Turner thesis. So to this day, we still grapple with him. So he's significant. I mean, you don't go to graduate school in modern times without dealing with Frederick Jackson Turner. It's impossible to get through any kind of advanced course on the West without dealing in some ways with the Turner thesis. He would later move on to Harvard after 1910. He became a mentor for other students. So if you don't think professors mean and can influence individuals, if your students go to graduate school and they've had you at some level, they will adopt a lot of your ideas. So Turner's students go out and they write, and sometimes they carry forward and we might say evolve the original Turner thesis. So scholarship has changed, and Turner is there. We have to evaluate him, and there's talk about him throughout the entire course of this class. But the scholarship trends have changed during the last 40 or so years, and several themes, if you want to have a takeaway of the themes of the West going forward in the new scholarship. One, and I placed a photograph here because I think it signifies one area of scholarship. It's called the non-vanishing Indian. Indians remain. Indians remain in the story, and they remain to this day, which is amazing considered they were nearly wiped out by the American movement west. We know that there were possibly, in the 1890 census, 250,000 Native Americans still within the United States. And that compares to about 75 million non Indians throughout the United States. That number is higher than 2 million, we think, right now, by our accurate counts, if you want to call the census, again, a real good, again, appraisal of the number of people that live in the nation. So that is one kind of revitalized area and topic of discussion, that there is an Indian presence. It did not disappear in 1890. And of course, we need to try as best as we can to get different perspectives of underrepresented groups within the U.S. A second trend, we might say, in scholarship is the impact of the federal government. So, as much as we like to attribute rugged individualism, personal freedom, the government plays a big role. You don't have areas of the West being developed without the government opening the territories. Now, this can lead to controversial things like Missouri, whether or not and how that would develop with slavery removed there. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was again to develop the West for settlers and for also the infancy of the railroad. You have to also have the government sponsor explorations. Lewis and Clark is one of them. What are they going to find? Basically, a way to get the fabled Northwest Passage. Can you get from Mississippi, the upper Missouri River, which is all that area, the country, the continent is based in guesses about what it looks like. Can you get all the way to the Pacific? The Stephen Long expedition and others, those that took place, the Freeman Custis in Louisiana, closer to home. These are all sponsored by the government. And when you have the government have its active role, it also has to grant railroad companies the ability to develop the land for transportation. There's also a theme of exploitation of the lands in the West, especially when we're talking about mining different precious metals, gold, silver, copper, later on oil and gas. Water rights. Will populations that have a strong concentration be able to monopolize a lot of the natural resources like water? Book written not too long ago called Cadillac Desert, which talks about how the West, there aren't as many people, but definitely there needs to be access to water. And then you've got the West Coast, which seems to take a lot of those resources. There's timber and whether or not you can control, and should you have some kind of policy from the government, integrating the story of the government again in protecting those natural resources. Cattle and grain have these boom eras, and all of it is what we now begin to study about the environmental impact of these fast growing areas, knowing full well that these regions in the West are somewhat fragile. Almost hunted down all of the buffalo because, well, they're in the way. People were shooting them from railroad cars. They were a source of food, blankets, and all kinds of other resources for Native Americans. So they were almost made extinct during the later decades of the 1800s. And of course, the global population moving to the West, mobility, immigration, um, Spanish, Russian influence in areas of the Pacific Northwest. And of course, the role of the West as a place where African Americans settled in the aftermath of the Civil War. Not much has been written about that until fairly recently. The Exodusters and those who left the segregated South to move to the West. And that increases and enriches our story about how diverse the population of one particular group. We connect with the West Cowboys. Were very much a diverse lot, more than we see in the movies or in the popular mythology of the West. So even before the West closed, meaning 1890 and the whole Turner thesis, there was a mythology about it. We have Daniel Boone, who takes people to the backcountry of Tennessee in the 1770s. That was the West once upon a time. Novels and these fictional accounts are written about him. Some are true, some are invented for readers. We have a series of books written by James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote the Leatherstocking Tales. One of the most famous is, of course, Last of the Mohicans, the Pioneers, the Deer Slayer. There's, I think, 5 books total in the Leatherstocking Tales that were written in decades before the Civil War. Hawkeye, the main character, he goes by different names in these novels, was modeled on Daniel Boone, and he's a recurrent character in these 5 Leatherstocking novels. And so these characters allow Cooper to stage conflict between, as Turner would call it, civility, natural freedom, the line or the kind of arbitrary designation between civilization and savagery, as Turner talked about. So the wilderness will slowly become a village. It will become a town. There will be manufacturing. It will look more and more European. That's how, in his mind, it developed. And it already did exist in the 1820s. And so he's writing, and he's based, as James Fenimore Cooper, in upstate New York. So he's writing about a mythical past of a bygone era, and that era was already gone for people who were living in the marketplace of the 1820s, and they very much appreciated his novels that came out during this time period. So this 1890 end of the West is really misleading, because after 1890 the government continues to give away land. Oklahoma is settled literally in like one day, and that's why the nickname of their major football university are the Sooners. These are folks who kind of jumped the race to open up the remaining land that wasn't dedicated to Native Americans in Oklahoma, going back to the time of Andrew Jackson. So the land rush in Oklahoma gives birth to that term, the Sooners. More significant development after 1890 is what happens to frontier history. And this, going back to Turner's idea that the frontier might be closed, what does it mean for the future of the United States? So, of course, we go back and look at this bygone era, and you know we'll never see it again. That's why the word we often use again and again is nostalgic. One of the first westerns to appear as a western book is Owen Wister's Virginian. And he published it because the cattle trails were basically over, and he was trying to talk about a dying breed, the romantic cowboy. In some ways, every cowboy tale, every author, every story comes from Owen Wister, who writes a book called The Virginian. You don't even know the guy's name, because I think it's mentioned one time in the entire book. There's a villain in there as well. There's, again, a great story. And a lot of people are motivated by reading this tale of a time in our past that we will no longer be able to go back to. And it motivates people like, well, there's a very young Theodore Roosevelt. The Virginian comes out in 1902. By that time, Teddy, had already traveled to the West. In the 1880s, he goes out there. He's a Harvard graduate. He has health problems. The dry climate is supposed to help his asthma. He slept outdoors, bathed in icy creeks, drank from a tin cup. He joined cattle roundups. He joined a posse looking for a runaway criminal, all because he was very much motivated. And then later on, he would write a history, a multi volume history of the American West. So going back to the Virginian, it was a very male-centered, self-sufficient West. Individuals who can go out there and remake themselves. His background of the Virginian, we know he's from there. His name's mentioned once. His background is obscure, and it helps create this legend of something of a hero, which emerges. Again, a very influential novel that's, again, more than at this point, 100 years old. And then, of course, to romanticize this bygone era, we have things like Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, and it dominated entertainment, the Western show, to represent this bygone era for the United States. What he would do, Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody, is bring cowboys. He would bring in Native American actors as well to the audiences in the 1880s. And these Wild West shows were incredibly popular. And in spite of the fact that a lot of scholars have beaten up on Turner, they sniff at the frontier as a true American experience, the West is very significant. So we're going to concentrate on the American West in this class, which is the United States West. Okay, we have a little bit of an introduction there in the early chapters of the book about the West as it did exist before contact. We're going to confine our discussion mostly to about 100 years, 1783 to 1890. 1890 also, not because it was the closing of the frontier, but it's also seen as the end of what they called at the time the Indian Wars conflicts. The battle, not so much a battle, more a massacre at Wounded Knee of 1890 is kind of like a formal end to concentrated Native American resistance as the United States government tried to, again, Americanize and then place Native Americans into reservations throughout the United States. So the aftermath of the American Revolution is where we begin. There's a frontier line there, but it's impossible to trace because there is a California west for the Spanish. We don't even, as a nation, occupy the entire continent really until the middle decades of the 1850s. So the West is a West of different nations. So we're going to begin the story with the West beyond the original 13 colonies, the Appalachians. The Ohio is the West, the Ohio River. Kentucky is the West. Alabama and Mississippi are the American Southwest at one point, the Southwestern territories. And it is a continent that is, in 1783, shared by different nations, a significant Native American population. Those who were enslaved, 20% of the population, African American at the start of our history as a nation. The English, the French, the Spanish, all have an involvement as well. So very briefly, that is an introduction to what we mean about historiography, the history of writing the subject of the West. It changes. It changes based on what's happening in our nation. And I can give you other examples when we're talking about, again, I mentioned the American Revolution, Reconstruction, the Great Depression. Was the efforts of FDR and the New Deal successful or not successful? So this is the interpreting American past. So once again, it's just a little bit of an introduction as you read the first couple of chapters of the book, and that you appreciate and understand some of the overarching themes we're going to be having in the course of the semester.